on the call is that in order to build bipartisan support and to really take this issue on, those of you working out in states really have to know your subject and know it well. And that's in part what we tried to do with what's in this toolkit. It never pays to mislead people on issues. So your understanding of what is going on in early childhood is really important. And the work we've done over the last year suggests that sometimes our own constituency doesn't really understand sort of the funding mechanisms and what's going on. So some of what you'll see is targeting that. And so I think what we will end up with is hopefully suggestions from you on what we can add to this toolkit that might help you do your work better, because we're very open to trying to do that. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over, introduce Megan Campbell, who's the Associate Director here at Bipartisan Policy Center for Early Childhood, and she's going to walk you through the toolkit, what she's done on this, and then we'll wrap it up by taking questions. And I believe, Megan, through the chat response on your computers, if you could just put your questions into the chat box, we'll try and answer them at the end. And also your suggestions for how we can help you by putting more things in here that might be of benefit to you. So Megan, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Linda, and thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to join us for the webinar. And just to let you know, we will be sharing slides and we're recording in case you have questions later or there's folks that you know were interested but couldn't make it today, because we know there's a lot going on. So just to give a little bit, to add a bit to what Linda mentioned, the information that we've included in the toolkit, which includes both kind of this much longer PDF document that's on our website, as well as other resources we will be adding. It's come from all of our wide range of experience on the BPC Early Childhood team. Of course, Linda has a lot, and a lot of it has come from hers, but we also include folks from the Hill. I have a federal government background, people with state government, academic research. So all of that has gone into building this, but we know that everything is different depending on where you are in the country. And so some of these things may be very new to you. For a lot of you, they will not be. But it's also supposed to show you kind of tools that you can use in reaching out to new people, building that coalition of new voices, and continuing to keep this a bipartisan issue as we move forward to help children and families. So with that, I will jump into some of the pieces of the actual toolkit. So this is very much aligned with what Linda was saying. The first thing in the toolkit we have are these 8 tips for building that bipartisan coalition. Many of them are, basic ideas for how to put together people and run a meeting, but we think sometimes, you've got to start with the basics, and really as a reminder that everyone is coming from different places, and we need to bring them together this way. Also, most of the resources that continue in the toolkit after this first section all feed into these things. So you will see how the resources can help you build this coalition. The key one, and I remember this is something that when I started at BPC, Linda really made a point of enforcing, is that these partnerships are not built overnight. It takes a lot of work to bring people together and get past some of their differences and find those areas where you can have agreement. So to build those relationships, you need to work together, and it can be slow to build that trust, but it's necessary to head off a crisis or even find an opportunity when a window opens and you're ready to jump on that opportunity, like when reauthorization was possible almost exactly 5 years ago in 2014, or when the caps were listed in 2018 and we got the historic CCDBG increase. Words matter. We'll talk more about this. It definitely came up in our work with Once Global. You need people to make sure you're avoiding inflammatory words and jargon, especially if you're trying to bring in new people. Not everyone knows all of the acronyms, and I know that's something that I have a big problem with, so it's always a good reminder. You want to work with people who want to work together and be open-minded when recruiting collaborators, but make sure not everyone might mix. And this is, again, about bringing in new people. We've started talking more with business leaders, bringing in the faith-based community. Everybody has a stake in making sure that early childhood education and childcare is accessible and affordable and high quality for families. You just have to kind of find the way to get them all at the table and meet people where they are. Everyone has a different level of knowledge, but they've all shown up. They're there. They've taken the time. And they could have been somewhere else or working on something else. So make sure to respect that and, meet them where they are at. Provide clear and useful background materials and space to ask questions and learn. Hopefully some of the materials that are included in the current toolkit and that we will be adding will be useful background materials so that you can just use those and jump right into the work. Be inclusive and mean it. You don't want to just be saying you're bipartisan and invite people who are maybe on the other side of the aisle and then not let them speak and not listen to them. Also, when you bring parents or providers especially who have taken time, really make sure that you're listening to them and giving them a chance and a seat at the table. Be open about what you're trying to do and be respectful when there are disagreements. Sometimes you will have to compromise, or sometimes you may have to agree to disagree, or you take a topic and put it in the parking lot or put a pin in it, whatever term you want to use, to keep the conversation going and productive. And then lastly, and this is pretty common sense, follow up after with the next step. Keep the momentum going. Make sure the steps are in writing, what everyone knows what they're doing, so no one is confused or walks away with a different impression than someone else. So those are our tips. And again, I know they're kind of a repeat for many people, but I think it lays a good foundation. So the first big chunk of the toolkit is a big funding background about about childcare and early learning funding. I think it's pretty brief, but I think it's still like 14 or 17 pages. But considering what it could cover, it's pretty short. And each piece is a really high overview of the many complicated components of the childcare and early learning funding landscape across the country. Hopefully, as Linda said, you need to make sure you have a strong understanding of some of these pieces, especially if you're going into a room as an advocate or an expert and people ask you questions. You want to be able to answer them or at least direct them to finding the right answer. So we decided to include this mostly background information to really give that overview. So most of you, I'm not going to dig into and explain this because it's in the toolkit and many, many of you know all of these pieces, though we are always happy to answer questions. And I particularly am always happy to answer child care funding questions. You can ask the rest of the team. So, we have a general start out with a general look at the current child care market because it is complicated. So, we look at the child care market and the fact that it's a market-based system where parents decide where they want to go. Then also at the price of child care, how much it actually costs families to access that care. And we know it's really expensive. So trying to look at how much they're actually spending, why that is, and why they need it. The business of child care, that's where we look at the providing of the care and try to talk about the low wages, the lack of access to benefits for child care providers. So we really lay out the fact that it's a very expensive product and very hard for parents to afford, but also a reminder that child care providers are mostly making poverty wages and many of them are having to seek additional assistance. Then we look at the business and employer investment in child care. Businesses have an incredible stake in making sure that their employees can access child care so they can come to work steadily, keep their jobs, avoid having to replace folks over and over again. So we look at how they have adjusted to this. And then finally, the philanthropic investment in it, which has grown significantly. There's a lot of exciting interest in child care, which is part of the reason why we want to bring this toolkit out to make sure that multiple sides can be included in the conversation. And philanthropic investments have shown that interest as well. After that main section of general, we then talk specifically, on federal and state funding for early learning programs. specifically on the Child Care and Development Fund, CCDF, Head Start and Early Head Start, TANF, and state pre-kindergarten investments. So that each gives a bit of an overview about the funding. For CCDF, it gives a bit more detail about the very complicated funding streams of it, which makes CCDF both fun and difficult to understand. And then we also have these kind of by the numbers pages where we've pulled together different data sources into what I think turned out to be very nice graphics that can be printed out as one-pagers. And each one has a header like in this slide you can see, so that way you can print it out and it can stand on its own. So if you don't want to take a 17-page funding explanation to an office, which makes sense, you can print out just these charts and they should be able to stand on their own. So that is the quick run through of the funding piece. And then next we have, we looked at the sources and resources we had around here and tried to think of what kind of very basic background tools and guides would be available, what would help you all or help folks new to organizing or meeting with legislators or pitching policy issues, and tried to give a really basic kind of 101 on some of those pieces. And a big start of it goes back to the research we did with Once Global in 2018 that Linda mentioned. And we've done webinars on this before, and we have several other resources on our website, that explain the data that we found. So, but what we decided to do was, reinforce some of the findings in the Once work and look at the fact that, because we want to continue to reinforce the fact that in many surveys, not just ours, conservatives and liberals all support investing and improving child care and early learning. It's just a matter of figuring out where we're going from there. So the toolkit summarizes these findings, and as I mentioned, there are more details available. But one of the kind of general statements that came out of the research that I think does a good job of summarizing, a statement that the wide range of political views could come together on is included here, and it's also in the toolkit, and that too many families are struggling. The cost of everyday life, including childcare, is too expensive. Moms and dads must work a second or third job just to make ends meet, and that means they're spending less and less time interacting with their kids. Parents need more time with their children to teach fundamental values, not less. So this is and then there were certain themes that came out of that work that they found reached across the aisle and were successful in moving people's views on early childhood. So one of the themes was focusing on growth and success. It's not about school readiness or improving long-term academic success. It's about preparing children to learn, grow, and succeed. You want child-focused messaging to frame the issues around the impacts of the children on children. Arguments around parents or workforce were less successful. Most Americans believe every child deserves an equal opportunity at a quality early childhood education, and you want to avoid using real or fair, focus on equal opportunity. Every family needs high quality learning programs, focus on that, and then keep the messaging positive. Particularly for conservatives, making an argument about closing the achievement gap or coming at it from a negative space doesn't work. To reach them, you want to reframe the message using positive language. And then lastly, I included these 21 words for the 21st century. Again, it's in the toolkit, it's in our other materials. I think it's really useful when you're trying to find the right way to phrase something. We've got it here for you. And these were tested, and especially things like equal access and efficient and effective tended to work across. And then we have this final closing piece with the words that work and how every child deserves an equal opportunity to a quality educational foundation that will prepare them to grow, learn, and succeed. We also have a few other guides in the toolkit. Like I said, they're mostly kind of 101s for building groups and meeting with folks. So I've kept that brief here, but you can see it in there where it talks about convening the coalition, who to invite, what kind of questions to ask, what materials to create, putting together an elevator speech in case you get an opportunity to speak with someone from 30 seconds to a few minutes, or attending and hosting a child care meeting with policymakers, how to do some research, what questions to ask, what kind of follow-up, especially inviting people to site visits, child care centers, et cetera. It's a big one and very helpful, especially when they're home during recess. But many of you are very familiar with those items, so we will not spend a lot of time there. Okay. So what we wanted to do was make sure in the toolkit there were resources that weren't just background, that weren't just making sure that you had the information you needed when you went out into the world or met with people or were training people to help teach them about the program. So we took some of the information that we had with the Luntz research for messaging, as well as looking at different arguments we knew were effective in reaching different audiences. Sometimes you have to just find the right argument for your audience. Some people may be much more willing or interested based on the early child development argument. Others, it might be about it as a work support. Another might be parental choice and the fact that they like a voucher program. You just have to find that space. And while it won't always work, this can give you more options and more resources to get to that middle ground and find some new champions. So in the toolkit, we included 4 summaries based on different types of arguments that are research-based. One is on the science of early childhood development. The other is market-based mixed delivery child care system, and then the economic impact of the child care industry and strengthening families through child care. So we created those 4 documents, and then we included some takeaway messages, and at the end we have some talking points that complement each summary so that you can use the summary document, it's a 1-pager, you can use it as background, you can leave it, but then you have some talking points to go with it that are based on our tested messaging. So everyone, most of you at least, are probably very familiar with all of these different arguments. We kept them very high level, much more about giving the most basic background, getting in there, getting you the conversation going, and then you can fill in the basics. So I'm just going to go over one example so you can see how it's laid out in the toolkit and the resource that's there. So the first one we had in there is about the science of early childhood development. We have a focus on the different research on brain development, positive interactions, and building a strong foundation, and the role of child care in there. And then we have a takeaway message at the end if you're talking about the topic. And this way also someone, if they're just scanning, they get kind of the headline so at the end of the document. And here we have that children only get one chance at learning and fundamentals. Every child deserves an equal opportunity to a quality educational foundation that will prepare them to grow, learn, and succeed in education, society, and life. And then at the end, we have a few talking points to help you as a resource when you're handing out the document, right? And they're based, again, on the Luntz language. So this looks very familiar. I'll just point out the first one again, avoid talking about the achievement gap because it's a decisive and negative, and focus on the positive. Early childhood programs provide a foundation for educational success for all children. So we have those talking points for each of the 4 I mentioned. And then moving forward, right now you can print these out. They come out as a 1-pager. It's front and back from the book. But we're also working on making standalone documents that we'll have posted online that will look a bit more like this. And this is our newest 1-pager that was not in the book but is up now. And it's on paid parental leave and child care. You can see there's a front and a back, and then there's a 3rd page with endnotes. But we'll have an option where it'll just say the link you can go to access the endnotes online. So you'll be able to keep it to the 1 page. So we're working on that. That's one of our, as the toolkit evolves, we'll have that, and then we'll also have more 1-pagers as we see them. And that leads into our upcoming resources. The toolkit is really meant as an evolving, growing document and page and product. So while we have this first big book of it, we will be adding to it and then eventually, excuse me, updating. So all of the new resources will be on this toolkit webpage that we've created. And you can see it's also linked on our webpage and links on all our documents. We already have a couple new additions to it. One I already mentioned, the paid parental leave one-pager. And then we also have a history of federal funding for child care and early learning that lays out a timeline from, before World War II to the present on where all of these different programs came from, and really emphasizes that each one kind of sprung out of a different reason or a different topic, and that's part of why we have this kind of disjointed system right now that we're all kind of trying to reconnect. So those are up and we will be adding. And then we've got several in the works, including an overview of tax policies related to child care, in-depth explainers about child care funding streams. There are a lot of questions about mandatory and matching funds, et cetera, and TANF, so we're working on those. Policy options related to grants and contracts for child care versus just using vouchers. Some case studies, because we know there are a lot of you out there who have been very successful in moving issues in areas or climates that it might seem surprising that they moved. So we want to write about that. And then some worksheets and a data guide for pulling state-specific information. We have the data in the toolkit, but it's not state-specific, and it also needs, data is constantly updated. And this way it will have a guide for if you want to go in, there'll be blanks, it'll tell you where you can find the data yourself, and you can fill it in and use those to take it with you as background. And we're always available to help you with figuring out where those data are if it's unclear. So that is the not as quick overview of the toolkit and what we've got in there and what we're expecting. But really, this is meant to be useful. It's supposed to be tools for you. And so it's not just, me getting to write about CCDF matching funds, as much as I would like to do that all the time. So we want to know what would help you. So let us know. You can tell us in the chat box, or you can send it in to us. Also, if you have any questions, we're open. And if you think of things later, now that you've heard this long overview, you can always email it into us. So I don't know.
So I guess that is sort of what is in the toolkit right now. We'd welcome any thoughts, ideas, et cetera, that you have. Just know that our work is available for you to take, download, do it, use as you see fit. It is, you can put your own logos on it. We're not interested in anything more than this information being useful to you. So as you think about it, what else would be helpful? I know that we have had some struggles along the way as we've worked with people around in the country of misunderstandings about how some of these things work, to the point that misinformation gets to legislators and causes all kinds of difficulties. So the goal here really is to try and figure out what would be helpful so that you can understand what you're talking about in ways that will help public officials do it. So we have a couple of ideas here. So let's see, what do we have here? Do you have any ideas when the resources in the works will be available? They'll be coming along as we get them done. We'll keep adding. We'll be able to send notices out to people when we've updated things. But there's not a particular timeline on things. A lot of that depends on our ability to just get things through design.
Right. We are pretty far along in the tax explainer. If there are resources that we listed that you think would be useful to have sooner rather than later, depending on your legislative sessions or who you're meeting with, let us know. We can prioritize. We can try to, at least, depending on where we are. But we don't. Yes, as Linda said, with design and our capacity, it varies.
There was another comment about would love to hear from folks on the ground about how they use this. So would we.
Yeah.
So
sure.
And as you use the materials, let us know what works, what doesn't work. Again, I think we're just trying to figure out how to help people around this country understand this issue better. So whatever you whatever your thoughts are, let us know. We'll certainly are open to suggestions. if it doesn't work, then what does work? It's kind of where we are.
Mhm.
Then there's, let's see. Can we read that one?
Oh, yeah. So it looks like one question is about how it would be helpful to have a primer on how the federal funding goes to states for child care, perhaps in a state-by-state way, and then same with how existing subsidy and scholarship programs work, particularly in a few states, depending on where they're working. And that's really helpful to know, and we will, part of with the more deep dive into the child care funding piece for the federal, we can make sure it's very clear about how it goes into the states and how the states are able to make those decisions. Some of that is, I will say, covered in our 50-state report, and we're happy to send out the link for that, and it's on our website. And there's some state fact sheets on each of those as well. And then also with how the subsidy scholarship programs work, we are working on some reviews of the state's Child Care and Development Fund plans that the states have to submit as their applications for their funding, and looking at how those programs are working. And so we can, focus on those pieces, since every state I know is really different. And if you're an organization operating in multiple, I can imagine it would be very difficult to focus on that. So we will look at that.
Will you be providing information about equity and how to work with people of color
or tribes?
Actually, yes, on that one. We're taking a look especially at some of the tribal issues and what's going on with the tribal plans, what's happening there, and the equity issue. Yes, we've got some other work going on. I think we would like to hear from you more specifically what you'd like to what information you'd like to have about the issue of equity. It's out there in many forms right now, in discussions, et cetera. So if you could be more specific on that one, that would help us be responsive. But definitely open to that. And certainly, many of you know my interest in the tribal community. We're beginning to do some work on that issue as well.
Mm-hmm. And we have been looking at some state policies related specifically about suspension and expulsion, which can play in with the equity, and so we're getting in the last phases of that document as well.
And, okay. Somebody just found the policy report on the administration, and we can send out another link to that. We are, as many of you know, working on this follow-up report to that report now, but we will keep that current, and we're looking at updating TANF numbers, et cetera, already.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And someone mentioned that they have used the Luntz research a lot, and it's been helpful. Mm-hmm. So I think that one has been an exciting tool.
That looks maybe.
Yes.
Another thing that might be helpful for people, and if you haven't seen it, we can provide a link to you. We just completed a survey with Morning Consult that looks at why people are making some choices in childcare that might be helpful to people out there, and we certainly can summarize that and put it in the toolkit.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we were interested in that work is looking at where parents prefer their care. Is it closer to home, closer to work? What are they choosing now? Things like that. There's some really interesting things in that Morning Consult survey results, and we will make sure that we get some of that into the toolkit. Mm-hmm. So that's an important recommendation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think that stood out from the survey that we've been seeing going around is that I think something like 59% of parents reported having to cut back on spending for necessities like gas and food and rent in order to fund their child care, which I think is a very kind of tangible way of showing how those costs are affecting families and the economy. So we're excited to see those, even though it's not, it's not good news. But
okay, now there's another question, and let's see if we can get the whole question on here. Question may be a long shot. Will you be providing more information on base child care co-payment child care subsidy rates and how they're calculated. More specifically, I'd like to know how co-payments figure into the percentiles that demonstrate adequacy of state-based subsidy.
Mm-hmm.
That one, Megan?
I'm over here like jumping up and down. If I haven't established it, I'm a bit odd about these things. So we are doing a big look right now into just in general how the rates, the subsidy payment rates are set and what the states are doing. That's part of our kind of scan of the CCDF state plans and really understanding what those market rates and those subsidy rates mean and how they translate for providers into often significantly less than the cost of actually providing the care, and how do we try to close that gap. So we can write about how that's working and then also how the states are using those market rate surveys. When it comes to the co-payments and the percentiles for the state's base subsidy, you know, it's like a general background thing with the regulations and how those pieces work. Technically, the co-payments and the percentiles are completely separate pieces since the co-pays are set based on family income and are supposed to not be based at all on the cost of actually providing the care. And so they should be disconnected from the base subsidy setting piece. But we can also discuss that when we look at the rates and when we put out the brief on that and make it much clearer how the copay and the subsidy reimbursement rate either interact or do not interact.
Another thing it's worth adding on this one that we are looking into and working on a document that looks at the market rate surveys themselves. Because there's, as many of you on this call know, the market rate itself, as I say all the time, is depressed. I mean, we're looking at a depressed market where people are underpaid because parents can't pay anymore, so the pay of the workforce can't go up. So we've been looking into the market rate issue, the fact that it is based on a depressed market, and then if you look at subsidizing at the 75th percentile of the market, you're depressing it even further. So we are looking at the market rate issue. What are these surveys really telling us? Are there options? I know that there's some flexibility that the states have. We don't know how many are using that flexibility, but we're certainly interested in looking at it. Okay. There was a comment here about making sure that we clarify the difference between what is a federal requirement and a state option. And I think along the way we've been trying to do that. Our information shows that most of these are state options, that the federal requirements are fairly, you know, there's in some cases there's definite requirements, but there's a lot of flexibility in the child care regulation. We know that states may or may not be using. So what's going on with the flexibility is an issue. For example, states can design alternatives to the market rate survey under the current regulation. How many are, we don't know, but that's one of the things that we want to talk about. The second piece, obviously, is what are the states doing on top of federal regulations. Sometimes that causes confusion, and I think we're trying every which way we can to clarify and be clear for the audience what is a federal versus a state requirement on these things. So let's see, do you have a summary of how many different states are investing in child care? How are they financing child care initiatives outside of federal funding? That's a really good question, and I don't know that we have that necessarily. We've looked at it in our 50-state report, but it only to the extent that we know about, you know, what's out there. It's very difficult and hard to dig into state budgets to find out what's going on in addition to the federal money and match, unless there's a big statewide initiative with child care dollars. I think there's been some in Illinois, some in Washington, definitely California recently. Some states are adding money in, but that's a good question, good comment, and something that we can take a look at. Okay. Again, another note about state-federal clarification would be so helpful. We've tried to do that in the 50-state report, and if you haven't looked at that report, I really urge you all to look at it. One of the things that we found in doing that work was that of the 9 major funding streams that are going from the federal government out to the states, only one, in one case, is the state told what to do with that. So in the other cases, the states have flexibility in designing, administering, et cetera, these programs. How much they're choosing to do that is the question, and that is spelled out in that report. So there's a lot of state flexibility out there, despite the rumors that, most everything is, the federal government makes me do it. This is where I was trying to say earlier, make sure you have your facts straight when you go to talk to your public officials in your state, because oftentimes you may be contributing to a myth. And I think there are a lot of myths out there about what the feds are actually requiring, and we're trying our best to sort that out. But when you tell a state legislator, for example, that he can't do something based on a regulation, be sure you're right before you go say that, because it gets confusing and sometimes ends up with conflicts out in the state.
And I think with child care, since it was so flexible before reauthorization, right, that the fact that there were health and safety floors put into place and even just a few more regulations or restrictions, that many states have seen that as having a lot of requirements and a lot fewer flexibilities, where there still is a lot. It's still a block grant. It's still there. So that's something that, in talking with a few states a few weeks ago, got added to our list. So I'm glad to know that's of interest.
I really do encourage for people on this call to really reach out beyond your own, your own early childhood friends to the broader community out there. I was at a meeting last night with people that work with Fannie Mae, and Fannie Mae and their housing is really interested in how do we get child care in some of these communities that now don't have any. Who among you are talking to housing and economic development people in your communities? That's the question we're trying to get, sorted out here. And hopefully some of these materials might help you. When I went through last night, the average pay for a child care worker in this country, jaws dropped at the table. They had absolutely no idea. So when you start to explain in real terms, with real facts, what's going on, you can get their attention, and they do care. I mean, these were housing people. So I think that there's opportunities out there for all of us to reach out beyond our comfort zone and bring more people to the table here. So I think that we've about run out of questions here. We had a lot of good ones. I think that we'll continue to look at this, and you all have Megan's email up there on the slide, so if you have questions or suggestions for us, please let us know. That's what we're looking for, is feedback from you all. So hope these materials are helpful, and take them and use them whatever way you think is helpful to you. So I think, Megan, thank you for all the hard work on this and the rest of the team. It really was a team effort here, and it was a lot of work going into it, but hopefully it'll be useful to people. So with that, we're going to wrap it up, and thank you for joining us, to everyone on the call. Thank you.
Thank you.